And so Jesus was telling a not only subversive but also a shocking parable, and a ridiculous one. And I think one of the points that he was getting at is that God purposely and deliberately chooses to work through the weak, the insignificant, and the lowly, and those of humble origins. And this has always been the way God works. If you look through the Bible, you will see this time and time again. For those of you who went to fall conference this past weekend, you probably remember the story of David and his call. And so what happens is Israel is looking for a new king. Their current king is not doing so hot, so they want a new king. And so God tells Samuel, hey Samuel, I'm going to go have you find a new king, and I'll give you a hint, it's one of Jesse's sons. So he goes to see Jesse, and Jesse parades his 7 masculine, brawny, tall sons in front of Samuel. And Samuel, one by one, says, nah, it's not that one. It's not that one. It's not that one. It's not that one. Through all 7, and at last he's like, well, Jesse, is this all the sons you got? Because it's not any of these guys. And Jesse's like, well, kind of forgot, there's this one other son that I have, and he's out in the field right now tending sheep, and he's the youngest, but I guess we can go get him. And they go get him, and his son was, his 8th son there was David, who would go on to be the most powerful and important and best, in my opinion, king that Israel ever had. And he was just a shepherd boy. And so basically the moral of the story is God works through the scrawny guys. That's just what I tell myself. Yeah, no, but the point is that God works through the weak and insignificant and unlikely. And you see this all throughout Scripture. I mean, think about it. Abraham, he was just a nomad. Joseph, he was just a slave and a prisoner. Moses, he was just a stutterer. Rahab, she was just a prostitute. Gideon, he only had a 300-man army against the Midianites. And Esther, she was just an orphan, just a common Israelite. And Isaiah called himself a man of unclean lips. And Jeremiah was just a boy. And it goes on throughout the Old Testament. And then you get to the New Testament. And like we read it earlier this year in small group, Jesus calls weak and uneducated and humble working class fishermen as his disciples and condemns the religious elite. And he shows love and respect to the utmost for women, which was in complete opposition to his sexist culture. And then to top it all off, he hangs out with prostitutes, and he hangs out with tax collectors and social outcasts and all sorts of people who are being written off by the religious community. So look at who Jesus says is, go to the next slide, this is the passage again. Look who Jesus says finds a lodging or a home in this mustard bush kingdom of his. It is the fowls of the air. The fowls, the pigeons, the scraggly fowls, the ordinary people like you and me. The eagles, the peacocks, the swans, they don't belong in Jesus' kingdom. Jesus' kingdom is for fowls, and the common and dirty and ordinary are the ones who find lodging in it. And I think Paul understood Jesus' metaphor as well. In 1 Corinthians 15:43, he talks about the body being sown in weakness and raised in power. And I think the best example of all is Jesus himself, who was sown a tiny mustard seed into a virgin's womb and grew up into the tree of Calvary, which now has arms that reach around the entire world. I think this mustard seed thing that Jesus is getting at applies at least 3 levels. First, it applies at the individual level, in that God uses a small bit of faith to create great, amazing, life-changing people. I think about the story of a man named Brother Yun, and some of you might have read his autobiography, The Heavenly Man. He's a Chinese Christian, and basically, when the communists took over in China, they kicked out all the Christian missionaries. They started persecuting the Christians and killing them, imprisoning them, and all kinds of stuff. Till eventually, around 1970, there was only about 1 to 2 million Christians left in China, and they were forced into complete silence under fear of death. This is where we come into the story. And then we see Yun's mother had heard about Jesus many years ago from a missionary, and had sort of believed in him, but then it had kind of gone away. And And then, around the mid-70s, like her husband came out with cancer. He was dying. There was nothing anyone could do. So she had a little bit of faith to pray to Jesus and ask Jesus to heal her husband. And Jesus answered and blessed her little bit of faith and actually healed him of cancer miraculously, like overnight. And it was enough to make their son Yoon believe in Jesus, and he became a Christian. And then he later went on to become one of the founders of the house church movement in China, which is now the fastest growing Christian movement in any time or place since Jesus. Christianity is growing faster in China today than it ever has anywhere in the world. And that's largely thanks to the house church movement, which he founded. He led over 3,000 people to become Christians in the first year that he was a Christian. So Jesus takes a small bit of faith and through it creates great life change. I think this also applies at the community level in that God takes small, faithful communities and expands their influence and grows them and blesses them. And I think about, I'm a senior here now, even like our chapter when I was a freshman, on a really good week, if everyone showed up to large group, it would be 40 people. And you look around here now, we have probably 70 here tonight, and on a good night, we'll have 100. And not that this isn't a good night, this is a great night. But the point is that, like, I'm not saying that's because of our faith, but I'm saying that's because of God's power, that like he takes small communities that believe in him naively and blesses them and grows them and expands their influence. And like our mission is to reach the entire campus with the good news of Jesus in a transformative way. And not just about the good news of faith, like my dad was saying, but the good news of the kingdom, which is what Jesus was more interested in. And thirdly, I think it also applies at the system level. And what I mean by that is that God takes a few people's childlike belief in justice, truth, and peace, and he takes their small and imperfect efforts and uses them to make a real difference. In the 1960s in the U.S., the South was still fiercely segregated, black and white. Every area of life was segregated. School, work, religious communities, everything was segregated right down to the color line of black and white. And one of the most notoriously racist cities in the U.S. was Birmingham, Alabama. And I lived there for a summer, and you still see the echoes of racism there. But what it was that really brought down segregation in Birmingham, finally, it was not Martin Luther King Jr. going to prison for civil disobedience, although he tried that. It was not the grown-up African Americans organizing through the church and marching and protesting, although they tried that. What finally broke segregation in Birmingham was something that happened in 1963. It was called the Children's March. And basically what it was is just a bunch of high school kids, all the way down to elementary school kids, and even as young as kindergarten kids, that went and marched in the middle of the city. And they had what was then an illegal gathering. Black people were not allowed to gather in any kind of city square. They didn't have the right to assembly. And so the police came out and started arresting them one by one, but there was too many of them. And they filled the jails. And then the police couldn't do anything. They could keep rounding them up, but then they would have to release someone else who would then go back to the protest. And so they owned the city, and there was nothing they could do other than finally like cancel segregation in Birmingham. So it was a bunch of kids, all the way down to like 5 and 6 years old, that just had a small bit of faith. And that was what broke segregation in Birmingham. So it applies at the individual level, it applies at the community level, and it applies at the system level.